I want to proceed to my introduction to Professor Mbembe. And I must, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to take part in this Zoom webinar, Professor Mbembe. We're extremely honored. It is only 2 days ago since you delivered the Stanford Presidential Lectures 2020, so it's certainly, you seem to be in the midst of a very hectic working week. Now, Professor Mbembe is a research professor of history and politics at Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, better known as WISER, at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Born in 1957 in Otiele in Cameroon, Professor Mbembe was educated at in Paris at the Sorbonne and at the École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales. Former director of Codestria in Dakar, Senegal, he has held visiting professorships at Columbia University, Yale, University of Pennsylvania, Berkeley, Duke, and Harvard. His international breakthrough, and there are a lot of accolades to go through, so I won't be able to cover it all, I'm afraid. But his international breakthrough came with the 2001 On the Post-Colony, published by the University of California Press. Among other central works in Mbembe's by now very extensive oeuvre, we find Johannesburg, the Elusive Metropolis, co-edited with his wife, Professor Sarah Nuttall, and published by Duke University Press in 2008, Critique of Black Reason, which was published by Duke University Press in 2017, Necropolitics, which was published by Duke University Press in 2019. And earlier this year, he published the monograph Brutalisme at La Découverte in Paris. A rare scholar and public intellectual who manages to address both Anglophone and Francophone publics in the global North as well as in the global South. Achille Mbembe's forthcoming Out of the Dark Night Essays on Decolonization was originally published as Sortir de la Grande Nuit by La Découverte in 2010. It is due out with Columbia University Press in 2021. Now, this monograph originated as a series of exchanges with the prominent French public intellectual François Verger. The central theme of Out of the Dark Night is, as the title indicates, decolonization, by which Mbembe means something more profound and fundamental than merely the coming into being of political sovereignty and independence in previously colonized societies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America after 1948. Like Frantz Fanon before him and Adam Getertchev after him, Mbembe in this monograph sees decolonization and revisiting these crucial and formative events as having profound implications for our ways of viewing the world. It constituted forms of world making, in other words. And to conclude, I will hereby, because Professor Mbembe is obviously much more qualified to talk about his own work than I am, I hereby leave the word to Achille himself, who will introduce Out of the Dark Night Essays on Decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sindre. Sindre is not only a colleague, but a very good friend of mine, who has inspired me a lot, not only through his own work, but also through his ethical engagements in causes that are universal, so to say, or in any case, causes that are very dear to a lot of us, wherever we find ourselves in this tormented world today. So I'm very grateful for the invitation by the collective. I also thank, of course, Soraya, Samuel, Bodhisattva, Mumita, and all the others who are working hard in the background. As Sindre said, Out of the Dark Night was first published in French in 2010. And that was the year when most African countries were celebrating their 50th anniversary of independence. And I had been invited then by the director of the then director of Édition La Découverte in Paris to propose a set of reflections on what happened to that big aspiration, the aspiration for self-determination, which characterized, let's say, the post-war era, at least in our part of the world, in Africa. So, Out of the Dark Night came out 10 years after On the Postcolony. And to some extent, I wouldn't say it is a sequel to On the Postcolony, but in my own intellectual journey, it is part of that, let's say, inquiry, which first led me to write On the Postcolony. The title of the book is taken straight from Frantz Fanon. The term Out of the Dark Night figures in one of his works. I can't remember the title now, but I cite it in the text. So, Sindre, your collective is then asking me now to make some comments 10 years later on a text which appeared then. And I would like to, as a matter of introduction, say make 3 series of brief remarks, after which I think we will have our conversation. I would like to make a number of short remarks, first of all, on the concept of colonization, since the subtitle is Essays on Decolonization. We cannot talk about decolonization without saying something about colonization itself. It seems to me that historically, the expansion of colonialism had to do with the broader question, who does the earth belongs to? Colonialism was a response to that question, which, by the way, is still with us. I think that was the key question underlying colonial conquest, imperial expansion, since the 15th century. And with the partition of Africa in the 19th century, European powers had decided that the earth in its entirety belonged to them, which means that they were its true owners. They could occupy lands that were populated by foreign people or distant people. They could exploit these lands, as well as the people who had always inhabited them. thereby carving out spheres of domination and influence each of them had control over. So when we talk about colonialism or colonization, the question we have on the table is, who does the earth belongs to? And when we talk about decolonization, we are responding to that question. We are saying the earth doesn't belong to Europe. The earth belongs to all who inhabits it. Here plagiarizing the first sentence of the South African Freedom Charter, where it is said South Africa belongs to all who inhabit it. The problem then being, how do we define the all? What turns the all into anything like a common? Or is the all simply constituted by separate parts and fragments? How do we compose the we, the all? Through what types of travails and conflicts and negotiations and compromises? So that's the first set of comments I want to make on the idea of colonization. Second, it seems to me that to a large extent, colonial expansion was a planetary project. Not only was it an earthly project, it was a planetary project. Of course, it was driven by, in large part, by national states, national business companies, private companies, all kinds of monopolies. But it had mostly to do with the reallocation of the Earth's resources and their privatization by those who had the greatest military might, and I would add the largest technological advantage. So when we read it from a historical perspective, it was a planetary enterprise. That is the reason why decolonization, for it to make sense at all, has to be a planetary project. It can't be a national project. It cannot be the project of just one region. It has to meet colonialism in so far as colonialism was itself a planetary enterprise. And in that sense, decolonization is, if you want to put it philosophically, is a radical openness of and to the world. It is, if you want, a deep breathing for the world, as opposed to insulation, as opposed to, let's say, the term in French is fermeture, clôture, the fact of closing in on oneself, the fact of secession, if you want. It has nothing to do with seceding from the world or partitioning the world again. It has all to do with a radical embrace of the earth and of all who inhabit it. Third comment on colonialism or colonization, although you understand that the two are not exactly the same, I think that there is an explicit kinship between colonial predation and contemporary forms of resource extraction and appropriation. in the sense that in each instance, can add to it, of course, plantation slavery and other forms of domination, in the sense that in each of these instances, there is what I see as a constitutional denial of one fact. The fact that we, the humans, co-evolve with the biosphere. We depend on it, we are defined with and through it, and therefore we owe each other a debt of responsibility and a debt of care. Colonialism is the negation of that debt, the disavowal of that debt of care and that debt of responsibility. And this is, of course, still unfolding, if you want. An important difference is between yesterday and today is, one of the many differences is the technological escalation, which in my mind has led to the emergence of a form of capitalism, which today is computational, in the sense that we are no longer in the era of the machine, like in the 18th, 19th century, but in the age of the algorithm. And technological escalation, in turn, is threatening to turn us all into artifacts and to make redundant a huge chunk of the muscular power capitalism relied upon for a long time. Finally, as far as colonization is concerned, it is important to absolutely keep in mind the fact that it relied on racial subsidies. But of course, the technologies of racialization have nowadays become ever more insidious, ever more, if you want, encompassing. And as the world becomes a huge data emporium, tomorrow's technologies of racialization might be more and more generated and instituted through data, through calculation, through computation. In short, racism is relocating both underneath and at the surface of the skin. It reproduces itself via screens and mirrors of various kinds, is becoming both spectral and fractal. So those are comments I wanted to make on colonization, if only to not correct myself entirely, but as a way of re-evaluating what I wrote 10 years ago. Now, same exercise for the other term, decolonization, and then I will leave it at that. As you can see, the book was written before, since I live and work in South Africa, before Rhodes Must Fall. It was long before the movement, the decolonization movement came and invaded, if you want, in the best sense of the term, South African campuses and became the big talk of our times. Because, as you imagine, decolonization is nowadays everywhere. If you Google the term, you will be absolutely amazed at the many sources in which it is cooked. So by alerting us to this, I am trying to make one or two observations. First of all, that it is not an exclusively South African preoccupation. But since I live in South Africa, I have the feeling that in South Africa, the term, in one way or the other, expresses concerns about de-racialization. But the imperative to de-racialize is also valid for Europe. It is, of course, valid for the United States of America, for Brazil, and for other parts of the world. It is an imperative for all kinds of reasons I really do not need to go through. The emergence of new varieties of racism in Europe and elsewhere, the reassertion, aggressive reassertion of global white supremacy, because white supremacy, let's say, trades, in fact, on internationalism. One form of white supremacy in a specific country, for it to grow, to support itself, to expand, needs support from other forms of white supremacism elsewhere. So we see the emergence of populism, retro-nationalism, and the weaponization of difference and identity. These are not only symptoms of a deep distrust of the world, they are also fostered by transnational forces capable of making that same world inhospitable, uninhabitable, and unbreathable for many of us. So this is, I say all of this because decolonization is still to come in that regard. We can only think of it in terms of that which is to come. Not necessarily in terms of what has happened. Although there have been instantiations of what it might be like. But fundamentally, it is an event that is ahead of us. That is by definition always ahead of us. The point is then, how is it that we bring it into existence? How is it that we compose it? Just like one composes a piece of music. That's how I understand it. It's not a sectarian injunction. It is, once again, an injunction for radical openness to the world at large, to the earth. A radical injunction which itself is premised on the deep belief that the earth belongs to all who inhabit it. So, all of this having been said, I would like to end by pointing attention to the ongoing histories of colonialism. That on the one hand, decolonization is always ahead of us, and on the other hand, we are still confronted with ongoing experiences of colonialism. A key element of which today is what I call techno-molecular colonialism. What I'm saying, therefore, is that we need to develop a broader understanding of colonization. Colonialism is going on, for instance, when the world we inhabit is understood as a vast field of data awaiting extraction. Colonization is going on when we throw out of the window the role of critical reason and we reduce knowledge to the mere collection of data. Its analysis, its use by governments, military bureaucracies, or corporations. Colonialism is going on when we are surrounded by so-called smart devices that, of course, allow us to see each other. I can see Mumita, I can see Sindra, I can see Samuel. But at the same time, smart devices that constantly watch us, record us, harvesting vast quantities of data, or when every activity or every step, every movement, bodily motion, especially from the undesired, is captured by sensors and cameras embedded within them. Triggering, therefore, the kind of war on motion that is going on right now, which has produced countless migrants all over the world, people begging to belong, but kept at the door. If, when they are not, purely and simply let to drown in the Mediterranean or let to rot, for Africans in particular, in the deserts of the Sahara, if not at borders such as the one between Mexico and the United States of America. So it's a kind of colonialism which operates in a different way, in the sense that it surrounds us by, it's of course about extraction, it's about capture. I mentioned the cult of data, but it also surrounds us with multiple and expanding wave fronts of calculation. These are some comments I wanted to share with you. As you understand, decolonization, to be more than a slogan and to be given an edge, for all of this to happen, we need to attend to these shifts, particularly in relation to the Anthropocene, as well as, just I have been saying, in relation to the reticular nature of computational technologies and the softwareization of our existence and that of every other living entity on Earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mbembe. We turn now directly, I think, to the panel. And the first one now is Associate Professor Mumita Sen at MF School of Theology in Oslo, Norway. Mumita?
Thank you so much, Professor Mbembe. This was a wonderful, wonderful addition to your book that we enjoyed reading so much. I think my question follows from your point on the fact of incomplete decolonization. and that it's always coming. My question comes from the studies of Indian subcontinent, where ancient and medieval histories and more studies into them are clearly showing that racialization and the othering of oppressed caste Hindus, it existed long before colonization. So, for example, Buddhists were the other for dominant caste Hindus, to be now replaced or later replaced by Muslims. Now, in India, we're seeing a great epistemological and political upheaval around the caste question. And I think a lot of caste scholars are concerned with what we call de-Brahminization, Brahmins being the priestly caste, where often the talk about decolonization appears to be a concern of upper caste Indian academics who are questioning Eurocentrism. So at the margins of knowledge production within India right now, many organic intellectuals and oppressed caste activists are grateful for colonization, in fact. They are grateful for English and for so-called Western values of equality that are enshrined in our constitutional democracy, which work precisely against priestly caste ideologies. So it's precisely because without the external intervention of the colonizer, the stronghold of upper caste Hindus could not have been shaken. So I was wondering what you think about this kind of use of the legacy of the colonial regime to deal with unresolved hierarchies of the pre-colonial. And can we say even that the question of de-Brahminization can arise when Europe has been decentered and the internal conflicts of South Asian hierarchies have been recentered? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mumita. It's a very interesting question that you are raising, and I might say that it's not peculiar to India. In fact, if we are to believe a number of historiographical and anthropological studies of colonialism in Africa, a more or less similar process was unleashed in the encounter between the societies of the continent and colonial forces that intruded in fact, well before formal colonialism in the 19th century. A key element in this redistribution of almost everything, a key force, key vector was Christian evangelization, which has led a number of us to put forward the idea that colonization was not simply opposing African societies, however you want to define them, and the West. That in fact, in the context of colonization, the first lines of divisions became internal to African societies themselves, opposing those who had been previously made to occupy subaltern positions, and those who were, if you want, the dominant forces, social forces. So in fact, in this sense, what colonization does is to trigger within the colonized societies themselves a kind of internal civil war. Put civil war in entre guillemets, whatever, you see what I mean.
Quotations.
Quotation marks, yes. I'm sorry, I mean, I think in French and then I try to translate. And sometimes the words go on strike. They don't want to come up. So this element of the potential embedded in the historical event, colonialism, of triggering a civil war, which means setting brothers against brothers, sisters against sisters, parents against their sons and daughters, messing up the family, is absolutely something we haven't probably paid much attention, at least not in so-called postcolonial theory or decolonial theories. So that's what I can say for the time being. Buy into your call to render all of this a bit more complex. But the fact that former subalterns within our societies used colonization as a leverage to advance their causes or to open up spaces from which they were previously barred from entering, that doesn't justify colonialism as a matter of fact. It doesn't make it more palatable, if you want.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Samuel Moses Ntapanta, who's a doctoral fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology, University of Oslo. Samuel?
Yeah, thank you a lot, Professor Mbembe, for a very nice, very condensed book, but also for this discussion that you started with. I will try to go quick to my questions without a lot, because the book actually pose a lot of questions that I could ask all day about the book. And actually, I'm going to cut the idea of decolonization as a planetary movement, and I will ask my question from the view of the back room of this this planet, which is Africa, where I'm from. So the first question I would like to ask is it happened, I'm from Tanzania, and in the book you have discussed, you have mentioned a little bit about Nyerere's Ujamaa ideas and a little bit about the Dar es Salaam School of Thought. What do you think? Is there any ideas from Nyerere Ujamaa that you think are worth taking into this decolonization movement or discussion in that small room behind the planet? And my second question, which is more about the movement itself in African academia. We know, as you have mentioned in the book, and discussed very deeply on how a decolonization movement is taking all forms from art, music, and my question will focus on the academia in Africa. And my question is, because the movement and theorization of decolonization in African academia has seemed to be very fragmented. It's not a movement of all together. And it's nice that you mentioned that in South Africa it came up recently. But what I see is the movement is not all together as a movement or as theorization of decolonization in Africa. And you have mentioned in the book several problems with the African academia, especially post-structural adjustment. So what do you think the African academia should move towards decolonization?
Thank you, Samuel. I think there is a lot in the late President Nyerere to explore in terms of political theory. One such thing that we might still want to go back to has to do with Nyerere's ideas concerning how to constitute a new political community. How do you put in place out of the intractable legacies of colonialism, of subjugation, how do you invent a new body politic, a new common? And I mention the common because it was key to Nyerere's thought, which he called, of course, African socialism. He wasn't the only one to imagine a form of socialism that would not simply be a repetition of socialist traditions coming from Western experience of industrialization, of proletarianization, and all that ensued. He was keen to design, not only to think or imagine, but also to design, which requires an element of implementation, to design something, a model, that would, let's say, emerge out of the creative capacities of ours, and would reflect the anthropological and historical dynamisms of our own societies, which are not limited to all that came out of our encounter, brutal encounter with colonialism. Because we have a history, a long history prior to colonialism. So it seems to me he tried to draw from that deep archive in in the manner in which he imagined and designed a new body politic. And that kind of creativity hasn't, as far as I'm concerned, been subjected to the kind of serious methodical philosophical criticism it demands, especially now. So that's the first thing. Second idea, really a captivating concept Nyerere put forward, has to do with this idea of self-sustainability. Self-subsistence, if you want, all of which, let's say, speaks to what? To our capacity to stand on our own feet. To believe that the fate of our continent lies in our own hands. So a theory of responsibility. If it goes wrong, it will be partly because we haven't taken care of it to the extent we should have. So that theory of responsibility, which he translated in the term self-sustainability, I think that it is absolutely central to contemporary debates on how to, let's say, repair life in times of extremes of climate, extremes of brutalization, extremes of world order gone pretty astray, as we can see. So all of that is still actual. So all of this to say what? That there is an actuality of Nyerere which is there, and it's waiting for people like you yourself, let's say, to uncover it. As far as the decolonization as a movement is concerned in the rest of the continent, I have to say this. I mean, it used to be a movement. We have to look at this historically and make the proposition that there were phases in our history when it was a real movement in the sense that ideas were generated, all these ideas about liberation. It's a literature we really need to go back to. A movement also in the sense of assembling people, assembling minds, assembling bodies, people on the street, making claims, learning to cohere a voice, a powerful voice that can be not only heard, but listened to. This question of being listened to, that can be acted upon. There was a movement. In fact, it's a movement that ended or culminated with the abolition of apartheid in South Africa. That's why when Mandela dies, Mandela somewhat represents the end of a very powerful moment in the 20th century. The moment when we stand up in front of the world and address the world, not only on our own behalf, but on behalf of a huge chunk of the humanity. So there was a movement which then in the 60s morphed into a tradition of thought, which is there. I mean, the Ngugis, of course, Frantz Fanon, a long list of people, some of whom paid the ultimate price for thinking in that manner. So the point is, how do we recover those memories which are subversive memories? Because when read carefully, they are an indictment against what we are witnessing now. So I would like to think of it in those dimensions as that which has been, and as that which, when if remembered properly, might open up a space for new forms of imagination, of new forms of futures. So that would be my comments to your observations.
Thank you. We then proceed to theory from the margins, technological buff, Budi. I'm not sure whether he's today wearing his Star Trek insignia. Yeah, there you are, right? But Budi has to get great credits for, all the providing us with all the technological support and details. It's been quite a monumental challenge in the last couple of months leading up to this event. But over to you, Bodhi, and your question.
Thank you, Professor Mbembe. This is fantastic. I mean, not just the book, which I really loved, but also this presentation. So, so my question actually comes from what we all have our own preoccupations that we bring to what we work on. And my preoccupation is science fiction. So I currently run this global science fiction project called Co-Futures. And when I was reading your work, and this has happened many times before, like there are so many resonances and so many synergies between the kind of work that I think is being done in global science fiction communities. And I kind of wanted, you do mention the arts in the book several times, but I wanted to hear a bit more from you about your reflection on the arts, especially because of the concept that you develop as well, the concept of Afropolitanism. And I was thinking, because there are similar concerns that we have in science fiction communities with Afrofuturism, with African futurism. At the moment, we have so many other kinds of futurisms, indigenous futurisms, or Sino-futurism, or Indo-futurism. So I was curious to hear more of your thoughts on how Afropolitanism would, would kind of like, how it would connect or speak to all these other kinds of futurisms, especially since you also bring up the question of the planetary, right? And within Afrofuturism, a lot of the concern is that, this is not just about Africa. This is actually a planetary movement from which everyone can draw inspiration, and other movements have. So where does Afropolitanism fit in this whole discussion, and how can can we also see this in a way as a response or an antidote perhaps to nativism? So yeah, any thoughts would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Bodhi. See, what I call Afropolitanism is it emerges out of an observation. I travel a lot in the continent, and wherever I go, especially in big cities, I am struck by the sheer number of people, actual bodies, people repairing something. Repairing a tire, repairing a broken car, all kinds of things. And if so many people are busy repairing something, for sure, this practice might carry some meaning. If so many people are busy repairing something, for sure, some form or the other of knowledge must be at play in the sheer act of putting things back together. So, thinking about it, I came to the conclusion that what Africa is really all about is that it is a reserve of strength. But not only is it a reserve of strength, it is also a strength in a reserve. that in fact, it is one of the last laboratories of possibility for humanity on this planet. So the idea of Afropolitanism, that's where it is grounded in concepts of repair, in concepts of strength, in concepts of reserve, and in concepts of possibility. As opposed to a huge chunk of contemporary and past discourse, which defines Africa as the sign of lack. So Afropolitanism for me is maybe not an antidote, but it's one way of turning my back to the narration which only presents the continent as a lack, the Hegelian, let's say, fiction, since you used the term fiction. Now, of course, I mean, you look at the physique of Africa. I mean, its monumentality, which continues really to fascinate me. I was in Kinshasa just before the confinement. Kinshasa is a huge city. Nobody knows how many people live in Kinshasa. Frankly, they have tried to count them. They haven't been able to. But we know that millions of people, just as in Lagos, all these mega cities. So I was there, and I was about to catch the flight to come back to Johannesburg. So I decided to spend a few hours along the river, the Congo River. And impressive, of course, were the sheer volume of water and its power. We don't know how long they have existed, how long they will last. But as I contemplated this river, which is the second most powerful river on earth after the Amazon, it was difficult for me not to feel in my own flesh the turbulent stirring of untamed forces and energy, ones which perhaps can't even be tamed, these deposits of life. And for me, Africa is that. Afropolitanism speaks to that. If it has anything to do with the future, it is the future viewed through this immense, gigantic potential. The question then is, how is it that we free up these energies, these deposits of life, deposits of, in fact, 1,000-faceted life? How do we do it for the good of Africans, but also for the good of the earth? So you asked me about Afropolitanism, Afrofuturism, and all the other isms. That's how I relate to the others, if indeed they also speak to this metamorphosis of the infinite flesh of the world, to use the term coined by Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I had a question for you, Achille. We're going to go, I think, 10 minutes over time. I hope that is okay with you, since we got off a bit of a late start here, given some technical difficulties. But one of the key chapters of Out of the Dark Night, Essays in Decolonization, is entitled The Long French Imperial Winter. So France has in recent days been back in the international media spotlight due to a particularly heinous terrorist murder of a French teacher in a Parisian suburb by a radical Islamist, believed to be from Chechnya. Out of the Dark Night was originally published, as we mentioned, Sortie de la Grande Nuit, back in 2010. And one could argue that it speaks more than anything to a contemporary French context in which has long been in the making, in not least in the West Africa of your origins, in which there is a widespread elite and intellectual denial or disavowal of the brutalities of French colonialism, but also of contemporary French racisms. In chapter 5, in other words, the long French imperial winter, you write about the quote-unquote increasing provincialization of French thought, the quote-unquote retreat of a truly planetary French thought, and the attempt to quote-unquote disqualify post-colonial studies en bloc in France. Now, looking back at this some 10 years after the publication of the original title in French, how would you describe, and I realize that this is a big question, of course, how would you describe what has happened in this interregnum in France?
A lot has happened. In particular, I would say in terms of the reconfiguration of what we should call national identity politics. The fact is that there was a moment in recent history, meaning 19th, 20th century, a moment during which I think struggles for identity were part of general struggles for human emancipation. This was also the case for national liberation struggles. Such was, prior to that, of course, the case of the struggles to abolish slavery, colonialism, struggle for women's liberation, or even the US civil rights struggles, the struggles against apartheid in South Africa. I say this because such struggles, let's say, their ultimate goal was not to enshrine difference. They were struggles for the recognition of the greater number, the recognition of each and of all as humans among other humans, and as such called on together with these others to build, as I have been saying since we started, to build a world that all could inhabit. So it seems to me that at stake in those struggles was the aspiration to construct something that could be shared as equitably as possible. That is because this had to do with, let's just call it a foundational something in common. And that's why such struggles were endowed with a huge coefficient of universalism, if that is by universal or universalism, we mean the possibility of making a world in common and not making a world to the advantage only of some, or making a world regardless of, despite, or against others. I say all of this to then come to the point. Now you ask me what is going on, what has been going on in France. Well, what has been going on is that in France, there have been endless controversies on things like the Muslim veil, on notions of secularism, laïcité, on universalism, on national identity, and of course on immigration. And these controversies, endless, every single day, every single week, have led to what I consider to be an utter trap. Increasingly, categories such as secularism or universalism have been mobilized in barely masked objective of stigmatizing minorities. And in stigmatizing minorities, especially Muslim minorities, and through that stigmatization in concealing systemic racism. The same goes for endlessly rehashed controversies around postcolonial or decolonial theories. You would be amazed that, this year, 2020, at the number of pseudo-debates, calls to ban postcolonial studies from a curriculum in which they do not even appear, call to use, I'm not making this up, to use the force of the state to go after people who buy into these kinds of theories, the dissemination of false statements having to do with the threat postcolonial studies supposedly represent for the university institution in France. So basically the a drive to create a hostile atmosphere to certain strands of thought which are accused of all kinds of things, first of all, of coming from being imported from America, of being in collusion with so-called Islamic extremism. We haven't yet, postcolonial theories have not yet been blamed for fostering anti-Semitism, as in Germany. And I don't want to say more than that, but I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow to the sheet, the charge sheet, is added yet that other sin. So that's what has been going on. Now, how, and your question is, how should we be reading this? Look, I would argue that this is, first of all, not peculiar to France, but that's not an excuse. but that it is symptomatic of bigger issues. And we should probably focus our attention on those bigger issues, and I'll list a few of them. The fact is that at the beginning of this century, as the earth keeps burning, and as some seek to force through the project of an infinite extension of capital, which neoliberalism is all about, both human societies and living things as a whole are being, it seems to me, reconfigured by the yardstick of digital technology. And this is therefore, I would argue, a period of our history which is, let's say, I would argue that we are on the brink of an unprecedented rupture. Why? Because the process currently underway risks driving the birth of a humanity that has little to do with the kind of humanity we inherited from the so-called Age of Enlightenment. A humanity on the basis of which we invented models such as democracy. What I'm saying is that the big issue in France is a deep crisis of democracy. A deep crisis of democracy in the sense that it's a democracy that was invented for the few, that is not able to accommodate what are called at the beginning of our conversation, the all. The all meaning not only the others in the classical sense in which we use that term, but also the quote-unquote non-humans, but also the living at large, le vivant. So the vivant in an age not of universalism any longer, but a planetary age. Ours is no longer the age of universalism. It's not even the age of cosmopolitanism. It's the age of the planetary. And the all in the figure of the planet should precisely be the starting point for rethinking democracy and giving it a lease of life, especially as it is surrounded nowadays by illiberal forces, to put it mildly.
So thank you very much. I give the last word from the panel now to Associate Professor Christian Soraya Batman-Jelic. And we will have to be short here so that we manage to get in some questions via chat from the attendees. Soraya, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Professor, for your generous participation. And as a, I'm sure as a panelist, we all panelists, so hope that you continue to be well and safe. My question will be then short and sweet. Throughout your work, your exploration of the African continent, culturally, philosophically, and so on and so forth, is plentiful. In one earlier part, you mentioned the exhilaration one feels to, quote, write the world from Africa, or to write Africa into the world or as a fragment. The deeper I read into this work, the more I wanted to ask you the following question. Do you sense any difference in writing the world from Africa, as opposed to writing the world from North Africa? I mention this in large part because many of the examples you use speak to Black African histories and experiences, and not necessarily to Arab African or Amazigh African experiences, save a few examples, such as the Algerian demands of the French to disclose landmines implanted near their borders, or even a slight mention of de Tocqueville and how he viewed Arabs. In fact, there is not one mention of the largely urban uprisings that took place in 2010 to 2012 in North Africa, chiefly in Cairo, Tunis, Tripoli. Now, we understand this because you were publishing this in 2010. But since its translation, perhaps you can reflect on this. Now, are these not worthy of any theoretical food for thought, especially when we consider how you yourself, you encourage people to see themselves as stakeholders, as part of the politics of, in your words, the ascent into humanity?
Okay, thank you, Soraya. Look, it's a very interesting question, and to which I have quite a straightforward answer. Look, I don't believe in Hegel's Africa. I do not believe in it at all. Hegel's Africa is, he calls it Africa, l'Afrique proprement dite, Africa properly said, which is what? Which is really a kind of excised continent. North Africa doesn't figure in it, but nor do South Africa. And you mentioned Algeria on top, South Africa at the bottom. And in between, you have the Africa's Hegel, which consists basically of this land of darkness. Conrad then wrote about, and which development discourse keeps, let's say, enforcing. So I don't believe in that. I don't even believe that Africa is only limited to the physical continent, physical ground I happen to stand on, in the sense that I think that Africa is what? My Africa is everywhere. Let's just, to be simple, it's diasporic. And you mentioned in particular what is called North Africa. I am, as we speak, directing a major project which is called Regions 2050, which is funded by Carnegie Corporation, New York, and the Gerda Henkel Stiftung in Düsseldorf. It brings together 40 international scholars, North, South, diaspora, African, non-Africans, to reflect on the ways in which the Africa as a space is being reconfigured beyond the colonial epistemology of lines and dots and borders. So it's organized around 4 clusters, one of which reconceptualizes a region which includes the Sahel, the Sahara, and the Mediterranean. The desert of the Sahara being, let's say, put to work here, not at all as a barrier or as a hostile environment, but in fact as a bridge between different geo-regional configurations. There's another cluster which deals, for instance, with technoscapes, the kind of Africa that is invented, that is being made to exist via the use of a whole set of technical devices which are typical of our times, how money circulates, how people move, and so forth and so on. There's another cluster which deals with a corridor that goes from the Southern Atlantic to Southern Africa to the Indian Ocean. So what I'm saying is that, look, to put it really briefly, my work is not over. Hopefully I will have a few years more. I can't do everything at the same time, but I can assure you that I'm getting there. And for sure, I don't believe at all in Hegel's Africa. If anything, I think that we are now far beyond Hegel's Africa. As I explained in the book, we are now in, let's say, what we have to do, the planetary turn of the African predicament obliges us in order to open up that space and consider it as a space in motion. But thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there's any comfort in such an assertion here from Oslo in Norway, there's pretty precious little about Norway in your books as well, Achille. So
I'll get there.
You'll get there too, for sure. Mumita, do you want to run a few questions from the Q&A?
Yes, we have 27 questions. So, Professor Mbembe, would you mind if I read 2 questions out to you at a time and you can decide what threads you'd like to pick up?
Sure.
I have to apologize for whoever's name I'm unable to pronounce correctly, but the first question is from Jörg. He writes that in Brazil, we have a mixed population composed of different ethnicities and races, customs and beliefs. How can we define we and implement a universalist decolonization project based on this reality? I don't expect a definitive answer, of course, but a way to think about this process. Would it be the same as South Africa? I guess not, since we have deleted our cultural references. This is his question, and I'm going to read you a second question from Matt Mahmoudi, who writes, would you say that the datafication of everyday life and the containment of human subjects by tech could be seen as an extension of the colonial imaginaire created by the act of counting colonial subjects by the British Empire? And taken to its extreme, is the Earth on a path to a transformation to a sort of abstracted digital, within quotes, refugee camp, where mobility is contained, experimented, and examined?
Okay, maybe you want to add a third one and then...
Yes, okay, excellent. The third question is from Ali Usman Bajwa, who writes, how this British colonization, and he writes in caps, snatched the mother languages in different parts of the world, and indigenous people are still deprived to have their native languages. Kindly tell us more about Punjab, Pakistan, specifically, as we are still facing the violation of basic human rights as for a mother language is concerned.
Okay, these are 3 different
yes.
Preoccupations,
yes.
And it's difficult to see how I can put them together. The Brazilian we. Look, I mean, I don't have the, it would be pretentious to think that I have any response to the Brazilian predicament. The responses to the Brazilian predicaments don't have to come from Brazil. All I can do is to, let's say, say something about what I know and see whether it resonates at all in Brazil. I guess some of it might and some of it might not. But after all, it's a matter for Brazilians to adjudicate. Now, are there any commonalities between South Africa, and Brazil. I think that it's a question that is legitimate, if only because the three matrices of modern Western racism are to be found in the United States of America and the Caribbean, Brazil, on the other hand, and South Africa. These are the three foyers, three centers of gravity, ground zeros, if you want, of modern racism. There are commonalities between them, but also a number of differences. The fact is that our discourse, global discourse on racism, is too predicated on the American paradigm, US paradigm, both in terms of what racism is all about. How is it that liberal democracy and racism coexist in the same framework, and how it is how the question of racism is to be resolved. The templates, both theoretically and practically, a lot of them come from America. And yet, the two experiences of Brazil and South Africa are not at all trivial. The big difference between South Africa and Brazil and the US, for instance, is that Blacks are not a minority here. And of course, you will tell me it depends on how we define what a minority is. People can be a majority from a political point of view and still remain a minority in terms of economic capacities, or for that matter, symbolic or cultural capital. I agree with that. But the fact that Blacks are a majority here must mean something. When I say minority, I mean, they control political power. It doesn't mean that the police is not brutalizing some of them. It doesn't mean that social inequalities have suddenly disappeared. But this is not America. And we must make something out of that difference in terms of our theories of what a non-racial democracy might be, for instance. Now, a non-racial democracy is not at all what, not so long ago, we're told Brazil was. I can't remember what the official term was, but the ideology was that it was a kind of space of racial conviviality that they have managed to set up in Brazil, a raceless democracy, which now we realize is not at all the case. So these are three experiments, and I can only express a wish that we take the three of them absolutely seriously, and we try to see what each of them brings to what could be a broad global discourse on racism or anti-racism for that matter, because we absolutely need it now. As we have seen recently with what happened in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, that in fact, the two big things. On the one hand, the struggle against racism, and on the other hand, the fight to keep the planet habitable. The two things go together. So there's a way of articulating a global discourse on how to think about planetary habitability, which includes indeed the effort to extend the benefits of democracy to all. In this age of the Anthropocene, there's a space there for renewal of thought. As far as question of language is concerned, here too, I mean, I can only speak from the continent, which is a Babel of languages. I mean, it's like the Tower of Babel. I don't know how you could say it in English, but we have thousands of languages, including in small countries of few millions of people. That if you want, plurilingualism is the norm. So the starting point for a discussion on language politics is not at all the concept of the mother tongue. Because there is, the mother tongue as such only makes sense in relation to a multiplicity of other languages people are forced to practice on an everyday basis. And you do an inquiry, research, you ask people, okay, how many languages do you happen to speak in one single day? And under what circumstances? The fact is that they are shifting constantly from one language to another. And in the process, messing up with all of them at the same time. I say messing up, I would say enriching them, tearing them apart, carrying with them fragments of this, pieces of that, bits of the other, and in the process, inventing or creating a linguistic imagination we haven't paid sufficiently attention to. And that linguistic capital, which is constituted and on an everyday basis, is now more and more routed through new technological devices, written through those technological devices, reshaped in the process, affecting not only the spoken word, but also the written word and the other forms of wording of which we don't even have a name. So I prefer to, let's say, frame the issue in those terms of languages in motion, and see where it leads us. And decolonization is also that. I mean, it's at the heart, this linguistic question is at the heart of someone like Ngugi's theory of decolonization. But Ngugi starts from the assumption that there's a mother tongue. And what I'm suggesting is that there is a mother tongue, yes, but only insofar as the mother tongue is inhabited by many other tongues. So this question of deborderization, of languages is it seems to me central to any politics of decolonization. I forgot the other question, but it's also because I really don't have an answer to it.
So I think we are a little bit over time, but I will leave it to you, Professor Mbembe. Would you like to take a couple of more questions, or should we send them to you later, just so you can look through them if you so wish?
I do think we have to wind up, right?
Yeah? Okay. So, all right.
If you can send me the questions, I will make an effort to answer them.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So to all our attendees, I'll have to say that I will make sure that Professor Mbembe has all your questions. And if he's able to answer them, we will make sure that you have access to the answers. Thank you very much.
And let me, from my side, say thank you very much, Professor Mbembe. I'm reminded at each and every encounter with you and your work by these famous words, if I am to paraphrase the late and great Aimé Césaire, that you and your work represent what he refers to as a planetary humanism made to the measure of the world. And we are immensely grateful and proud for you having taken the time for this Zoom webinar. It has really been absolutely fantastic. I should mention here that the first time I met Professor Mbembe was in fact at his home institute at WISER in South Africa during a conference back in 2006, hosted by WISER and the French Institute of South Africa. Now, the downside of Zoom's webinars is that we are not able to express our appreciation for Professor Mbembe in the way in which I distinctly recall that this was expressed back then, because he was then greeted upon entering the room at WISER with toy-toying and a lot of dancing and shouts of Achille, 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 which I still cherish as a memory. Now, before we wind up, we have to do a little bit of a commercial fragment. The Theory from the Margins Zoom webinars will continue with a session with Professor Walter B. Mignolo on decoloniality on November 18 at 18 hours UTC +2. So that's more or less 18 hours PM Central European times. I should also like to mention that this Zoom webinar has been recorded with the kind permission of Professor Mbembe, and that it will also be made available on the website of Theory from the Margins at www.theoryfromthemargins.com and on our Facebook pages. So if you want to see the recording, you're very welcome to do that at these sites. And finally, before we break, there is also a review essay of Achille's forthcoming book, Out of the Dark Night, Essays in Decolonization, which is due out with Columbia University Press in January next year. So that's courtesy of your publisher. There's a review essay of that coming out soon in Africa is a Country. And I wanted to close with some words from Out of the Dark Night, because if there's one thing that is also characteristic of Professor Mbembe's writings, it is a great sense of style. And so I think it is only appropriate that I read out some of my favorite paragraphs from his forthcoming book. And this comes from the epilogue. Unless I forget, we also need to thank all those who attended this Zoom webinar. But from the epilogue, page 229, where Professor Mbembe writes the following: if there is an intellectual, moral, and political heritage of African nationalism worth our energy in contemporary conditions, it is in this direction that it must be sought, in the message of joy in a great universal future, equitably open to all peoples, all nations, and all species. This is what I've referred to throughout this book as the politics of ascent into humanity. And finally, from page 224, this is what, in Promethean language, Frantz Fanon called leaving the dark night for life, while Aimé Césaire spoke of the desire for a more brilliant sun and purer stars. Thank you so much, Professor Achille Mbembe. It's been great having you, and all the best to all of you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.